Chapter 1. The siege begins. Night clung to the jagged ridges of Vrath's eastern slopes like a starving leech, thick and oily, swallowing moonlight and choking the stars. Wind howled down the narrow passes, carrying the scent of soot, snow, and the acrid tang of warp oil. Beneath the frozen earth, beneath the layers of dwarfen stonework and ancient ancestral halls, the Under-Empire stirred like a diseased lung inhaling its first breath in centuries. The siege had begun, not with the thunderous roll of drums or the bold call of horns, but with the whining grind of rusted gears and the warbling squeals of 1,000 Skaven. Clan Scryer, masters of arcane technology and volatile genius, had sent one of their lesser warbands, lesser only by the Council's vague estimation, not by the arsenal they dragged with them. Steam hissed from the backs of heavily modified rat ogres, their flesh stapled with bronze plates and warp conduits, eyes glowing sickly green beneath their iron masks. Carts loaded with warp fuel canisters juddered and shook as overworked clanrats scurried to and fro, dragging cables, setting up banks of sputtering generators, and arguing over which knobs not to touch unless they wanted to explode. At the center of this manic, squeaking sprawl stood two imposing towers of contradiction and fury: Warlock Engineer Skritblam Sparkshock and Warlock Engineer Whizclank Zapfang. Both were robed in the sooty finery of Scryer, their garments stitched with brass sigils and lined with trailing wires. Their robes were once deep crimson, but now they bore the unmistakable scorches and oil spatters of prior experiments gone awry. Their tails flicked irritably behind them as they bickered over a warped slab of stone, displaying a crackling schematic of the dwarf outpost above. No, I was given charge command of this glorious siege mission. Yes, hissed Skritblam, his wiry fingers tapping the map as if the force of his claw would compel the outpost to fall. Lies, you misheard the squeak message, snapped Whizclank, his voice warbling through a voice box partially fused into his jaw. His left eye was a bulbous brass orb, constantly refocusing with a high-pitched whine. It clearly said Whizclank Zapfang in command lead, Skritblam to assist support. You forget your rank, fool. Skritblam's face twitched, a muscle near his left eye going into a frenzy. No, it said Skritblam Prime with Zapfang as low-ranking help assistant. That garble flicker was just static interference. I heard it true, right? The source of their mutual confusion sat on a rusting cog crate nearby, a wheezing, blinking squeak relay device, its rune-covered antennae half-melted from exposure to a misfired warp bolt. The message from Scryer leadership had indeed been sent, but what arrived was a mess of squeaks, feedback shrieks, and half-discernible orders punctuated by something that might have been laughter. The end result? Two delusional warlock engineers, each convinced they were in sole command of the siege. Behind them, Skaven scurried to prepare for the assault. One group, following Skritblam's orders, constructed a cluster of warp lightning cannons facing the mountain's narrow approach. The air around them shimmered with unstable energy, green bolts occasionally leaping between coils and frying unfortunate ratlings into twitching husks. At the same time, Whizclank had ordered the excavation of a siege trench and the assembly of a doomwheel battalion, each vehicle sparking dangerously as it revved, loaded with modified warp batteries that leaked green fluid and hissed when exposed to air. To any outside observer, say, a hovering Skaven drone or a suicidal dwarf scout, the warband looked less like a coordinated army and more like a dozen competing factions trying to out-insanity each other. And deep in the mountain above them, Vrath watched. It was not a mighty hold, barely a trading outpost by dwarf standards, but its stone walls were true, its cannons polished, and its defenders fierce with ancestral hatred for all things rat-like. The outpost had sounded the alarm 3 days prior, when the first tremors of tunneling were felt beneath their lower vaults. Since then, every forge had been lit, every beard braided for war. Dwarfen war engines had been dragged into position, their runes humming with old grudges, their engineers muttering quiet oaths as they calibrated rangefinders and rune-locked triggers. Back in the Skaven camp, things were unraveling fast. Whizclank barked an order to one of his trusted underlings, a twitchy tech rat named Fleebsknarl. Deploy the Doomwheel Advance. Smash-crush their gate while the warp constructs distract-draw fire. Simultaneously, Skritblam sent his own orders to another command cell. Channel full power to lightning array, firestorm their cannons, burn-fry their towers. Neither warlock had consulted the other. Neither had coordinated timing. Neither cared. The result was a masterclass in Skaven tactical doctrine, chaos, carnage, and unintended hilarity. The Doomwheels surged forward with a screech of metal and warpstone. Sparks lit the night as the wheels spun across uneven stone, crushing clanrats and rocks alike. But just as they reached a rise in the terrain, Skritblam's lightning cannons fired in a roaring blast of raw energy. The green bolts arced through the sky, not toward dwarf walls, but into the center of the advancing Doomwheel line. 3 Doomwheels detonated instantly, their cores overloaded by the warp energy, exploding in flashes of viridescent fire. Shrapnel and rat bits rained across the battlefield. One flaming wheel rolled off the cliffside, screeching its final death song before vanishing into the darkness below. The remaining Doomwheels swerved and collided, panicked pilots squealing inside as their vehicles spun out of control. One ran straight through a trench full of engineers, setting up Whizclank's backup generator network. That trench ceased to exist in a wash of fire and gore. Whizclank screamed, his metal voice box spitting static. Sabotage, treachery. Skritblam did this, ruined all. Skritblam was already shrieking back. No, your stupid wheels were in the fire path. You blocked my glorious attack. They lunged at each other, teeth bared, static dancing across their fingers as they prepared to unleash petty, fatal spells upon one another. Only the intervention of a panicked Greyseer emissary, dragged into the fray from a nearby observation post, stopped them from annihilating half the warband with a duel of warp magic. Enough, idiot things, the council watches. Fail here, and your skins will be peeled flayed for fuel. The threat of official punishment, however distant and ill-defined, was enough to freeze the moment. But the damage was done. Dozens of Skaven had died before a single dwarf had been harmed. The trenches were a smoldering ruin. Warp fuel stockpiles were critically low from the misfire, and the engines were all damaged beyond field repair. Above them, in Carrick Vrath, the dwarf engineers peered through spyglasses and watched the Skaven fumble in the dark, their chaos lighting the foothills in eerie green fire. One dwarf turned to his commander and muttered in Khazalid, "Should we fire yet?" The commander stroked his beard, thick with silver rings. "Not yet. Let them dig their own graves deeper. Then we'll drop the mountain on their heads." And beneath the stars, the siege of Carrick Vrath continued, not with precision or order, but with screeching madness and a feud that promised only more fire and folly. Chapter 2, Boom and Blunder. The morning, if such a term could be applied to the smog-choked gloom over Carrick Vrath, rose slow and pale behind banks of poison fog and the warped silhouettes of dead trees. The air stank of burnt iron, decaying warp flesh, and the pungent musk of unwashed Skaven bodies packed too tightly in squalid siege trenches. Overhead, green lightning crackled unnaturally across the roiling clouds. The sky itself made sick by the warpfire exhaust belched from rusting vents and arcane turbines. Below that tainted sky, in the winding mess of the Skaven encampment, warlock engineer Skritblam Sparkshock stalked along a precarious gantry of bent iron and rotted scaffolding, clawed hands twitching with manic purpose. He chittered orders to a swarm of tech slaves scrambling to fuse warpfire charges onto the massive wheels of his latest invention, the Doomwheel, MK. A machine he proudly declared was guaranteed to shatter dwarfstone, obliterate gate thing, and definitely not explode on launch this time. Yes. The Doomwheels were a horror of heretical engineering, cobbled together from scavenged dwarfen axle parts, half-melted warpstone, and manic genius. Each one towered above the Skaven trenches, a cage of spinning death lined with electrified blades and bursting with barely contained warp energy. The latest variant carried experimental blast pods lashed to the outer rim, bombs filled with pressurized warp gas and shrapnel that would detonate on impact. More explosive yield, Skritblam barked, slapping the nearest ratling across the skull with a cracked volt scepter. Need bang shatter, gate must fall crack in one mighty boom blast or all fail. The slave, now drooling and twitching, nodded frantically and bolted off to add another unstable charge to the already weeping warp core. Far across the chaotic sprawl, on the other side of a trench network filled with sparking wires, rotting scaffolds, and half-eaten corpses, Warlock engineer Whizclank Zapfang prepared his own stroke of genius, the Storm Coil Array. A series of tall, spiraling pylons etched with pulsing runes, each humming with pent-up power. Warp lightning crackled between them in thin, hungry arcs. Unlike the Doomwheels, this was a more refined piece of work, at least in Whizclank's fractured mind. The coils would unleash a focused beam of supercharged warp energy capable of melting stone and armor alike. Line coils straight, aim true, or you all burn fry in test fire, Whizclank bellowed, his augmented voice box booming across the field. Several Skaven dropped what they were doing and scampered away, some on fire, some spontaneously combusting as the ambient energy cooked the air. He leaned into a jagged control panel, ratting knobs and flipping levers in random sequences that only he understood, if he did at all. A battered relay monitor lit up with a flickering schematic of Karakvrath's front gate, overlaid with warped targeting runes. Soon now, glorious flashburn of dwarf flesh, zap crack, scream sizzle, both warlocks, convinced of their individual brilliance and utterly unwilling to consult one another, had decided that this day, this hour, was the moment of victory. Neither had communicated their plan to the other. Neither knew what the other was doing. Neither cared. The stage was set. Skritblam's Doomwheels, now loaded with unstable blast pods and foaming warp fuel, rolled into launch position on a rusting track slick with rat blood and oil. Behind them, a massive spring-loaded catapult arm, rigged to a screaming chain of enslaved rat ogres, was cranked into tension. All is prepared, set. Launch on my mark, Skritblam squealed, tapping a cracked rune plate with one claw and sending a jolt of anticipation down the wires. Simultaneously, Whizclank's Storm Coil Array finished charging. Each pylon screamed as raw warp energy surged through it. The air turned green and sulphurous. Static made fur stand on end across the camp. Whizclank didn't wait for a signal. He didn't ask if the way was clear. He simply pressed the ignition rune. The results were immediate. At the very moment the catapult arms hurled Skritblam's Doomwheels forward, the first coil discharged in a thunderous crack, sending a bolt of concentrated warp lightning across the battlefield. It lanced through the sky like the finger of some angry god, and directly into the steel track along which the Doomwheels were racing. The warp bolt hit the lead Doomwheel square in its central core. What followed defied science, faith, and common sense. The core detonated mid-roll, creating a vortex of green fire that sucked the very air from the trenches. The surrounding Doomwheels, still in motion, were caught in the blast wave and shattered like eggshells. Shrapnel, gears, and chunks of flesh rained in every direction. The warp fire ignited the rest of the wheels, and one after another, they exploded in cascading gouts of screaming energy. The blast radius was wider than anticipated. Much wider. The trench network collapsed inward, swallowing entire squads of clanrats and machinery. Several storm coil pylons, too close to the disaster zone, short-circuited and discharged their stored energy directly into the surrounding scaffolds, causing secondary fires. Screaming ratmen, ablaze and blinded, stumbled into live wires and exploded like overripe fungus. One warp fuel tank ruptured, creating a geyser of flaming gas that engulfed Whizclank's central control post. The Warlock engineer barely escaped, leaping from a collapsing tower as the inferno consumed it, his robe singed and one ear missing. Across the ruin, Skritblam emerged from beneath a smoking cog pile, covered in soot and with only one eyebrow remaining. He looked around at the carnage, his destroyed doom wheels, the annihilated trenches, the sky still raining pieces of metal and bone, and began to shriek. "Sabotage! You did it! You did this, idiot fool freak!" Whiz-clank, from the far side of a melted barricade, screamed back through cracked vocal augments. "Lies, lies! Your stupid, stupid wheels of death ran into my coils. You're the saboteur, incompetent. Your coil beams fried my trackway. You built your track through my energy field, brainless sparkhead." The bickering was drowned out by the sound of a burning rat ogre collapsing into a trench full of warp batteries, triggering another explosion that hurled several clanrats a dozen feet into the air. One landed headfirst in a latrine pit and vanished forever. From the mountain, Karak-Vrath's defenders watched the chaos unfold. The dwarfen runelord, Master Balgrim Stonevein, peered through his brass-fitted telescope, his beard bristling with poorly concealed amusement. "They've blown up half their army," he muttered. "Morgrim, are we sure these are the same Skaven that razed Baragvar's outposts last winter?" His second-in-command, a grizzled cannon master, grunted. "If they are, I reckon they had smarter rats then. These ones look like they're trying to kill themselves so we don't have to." Behind them, the dwarf artillery crews calmly continued polishing the barrel of a runed flame cannon, waiting for the inevitable next wave of rodent insanity. Back below, the Skaven war camp smoldered. Over a third of their siege forces were dead, another third incapacitated by burns, madness, or sudden onset liquefaction due to warp exposure. The trenchworks were demolished. The generator fields lay silent, and both Skritblam's and Whiz-clank's inventions were now scrap metal and grease stains. And yet both warlock engineers remained alive, wounded only in body and pride. Each slinked off to their own ruined sectors, plotting revenge, not against the dwarfs, not yet, but against each other. Their feud, now blooded and burning, would not be forgotten, and Karak-Vrath remained untaken, unbroken, and entirely unimpressed. Chapter 3. Blame Scheme begins. Ash hung heavy over the Skaven trenches like a second suffocating sky, gray and oily, dusting every surface with the gritty residue of explosive failure. The stench of burned fur and scorched metal mixed with the coppery tang of warpstone fumes, making the air taste like rusted blood and bitter sparks. Skritblam Sparkshock stood in the half-collapsed remains of his forward command post, twitching and chittering with barely contained rage. A cracked volt wand clutched tight in his shaking claw. All was perfect, flawless. He spat to no one and everyone, his voice rising in manic octaves. Doom wheels calibrated exact, timing supreme synchronized. Until he, that drooling half-built cogpile of incompetence, interfered. He waved his wand in the direction of the still-smoking wreckage that had once been a warp-fired delivery conduit. A half-melted clanrat staggered by, dragging the splintered remains of what might have been a targeting scope. Skritblam barely noticed. His mind was burning hotter than the cratered trenches. Across the ruined camp, behind warped iron fencing and spitting lightning coils, Whiz-clank Zapfang stomped in a rage of equal magnitude. Sparks danced along the tips of his mechanical tail, and his voice box sputtered out phrases between distorted gurgles of fury. Sabotage, clear, Sparkshock twisted beam frequencies, redirected volt paths, no mistake, sabotage intentional. He lashed out with a clawed hand, striking a nearby Skaven scribe square in the jaw. The unfortunate creature dropped a handful of warpstone data slates, which shattered across the floor in a spray of green glowing shards. Whiz-clank ignored the scribe's squealing, stepping over the rat's twitching form as he reached his makeshift comms chamber. The war camp, now less a functional military base and more a sprawl of partially burning machine corpses, twitching wounded, and rats too afraid to move, was divided into two warped territories, one ruled by Skritblam's cult of madness and combustion, the other by Whiz-clank's doctrine of voltage and paranoia. Neither side was talking to the other, except, of course, to begin the blame scheme. Within his dented workshop, Lit by flickering rune lamps and the pulse of unstable warp batteries, Skritblam activated his squeak recorder. The device, a skull-shaped orb mounted with antennae and a warp lens, shuddered to life, projecting a green-tinted image of a Skaven sigil. Skritblam leaned in, fur bristling, his voice laced with venom. Official report for Council of 13, Noble Watchers High. This is Warlock Engineer Skritblam Sparkshock, rightful siege leader of Karak-Vrath Assault, declaring sabotage betrayal most foul by Wizclank Zapfang, heretic and coward. He stepped aside, gesturing dramatically to the view behind him, still smoking war machines, melted doomwheel frames, and the skeletal remains of several high-ranking warplock assistants fused together in a glowing crater. Proof of his treachery, proof. My precision doomwheels, timed perfect with dwarf gate trajectory, were attacked mid-charge by misaligned warp beams, fired without timing authorization or logic math calibration. Amateur stupidity or intentional sabotage? I submit both. He ended the recording with a flourish, teeth bared in a wild grin. His assistant, a half-melted tech rat with no tail and a stammer, took the recording orb with trembling paws, nodding rapidly. Send this now, priority gloat level, with extra insult markers. The assistant scampered off toward the central relay tower, which was half buried beneath a collapsed observation platform. Skritblam returned to his desk and immediately began drafting schematic lies to accompany the recording. Falsified diagrams, distorted power flow charts, and artificial data spikes. All painted a narrative of genius undone by another's idiocy. On the far end of the camp, Wizclank was engaged in an identical process. His recording orb floated above a shattered workbench as he barked into it, his voice box sizzling with hate. To the glorious High Council, ever-wise, all-knowing, and swift-punishing, this one, your loyal true servant Wizclank Zapfang, reports grievous loss destruction caused by imbecile traitor Skritblam Sparkshock. He pointed behind him at the melted remains of his storm coil array, twisted like giant spider legs and coated in soot. My storm coils, tuned to ancestral scryer resonance frequency, were violated, scrambled by the brute force launch of Doomwheel Muck, R3, a flawed, untested, unsafe device built against scryer protocol standards. He spun back toward the orb, drool flicking from his lips. Skritblam launched his unstable scrap piles through my power field. Deliberate, yes. Calculated sabotage to make Wizclank look fail weak. I demand honor punishment, execution, or at least demotion to sewer checker. He ended the recording by slamming a metal fist into the bench, shattering several vials of warp oil and starting a small fire, which was ignored. Much like Skritblam, he too sent underlings running to the relay tower, carrying forgeries and fabricated recordings, carefully edited footage of his coils firing properly, followed by shots of the doomwheels exploding as if of their own accord. For the next 2 days, the camp descended into a state of simmering, chaotic Cold War. Skritblam began inserting saboteurs into Wizclank's perimeter. Tiny ratlings with overloaded warp capacitors, disguised as messengers or gear runners. One such unfortunate detonated inside a ration tent, immolating 4 engineers and 1 unlucky rat ogre who had been napping. Wizclank responded with precision. A team of maintenance inspectors were sent into Skritblam's quarters, secretly armed with pulse disruptors and rigged with sabotage codes. They accidentally erased the memory core of Skritblam's backup Doomwheel blueprints and unleashed a plague code into the generator banks. A third of Skritblam's power grid shut down, locking his workshop doors and electrocuting 2 scribes mid-task. Despite the utter disarray of the siege, the trench lines still held, manned now mostly by shell-shocked clanrats too terrified to flee. Between the 2 engineers' zones, a cratered no-rats land had formed, strewn with the debris of earlier catastrophes. Patrols sent across it vanished. Rumors spread of warp ghosts, mutated slag beasts, and a particularly large electrified rat skull that screeched at intruders. In this wreckage-ridden purgatory, each engineer plotted their ultimate proof of superiority, a masterstroke of sabotage disguised as innovation. Skritblam's plan was elegant in its cruelty. He began secretly constructing a modified Volt Screamer, a sonic war engine that, when activated, would emit high-frequency pulses tuned specifically to the alloys used in Whizclank's coil frames. The device would cause catastrophic structural vibration, reducing the towers to shrapnel with a single hum. He worked feverishly in a sub-trench beneath the latrine tunnels, hiding his activities even from his own staff. Quiet, secret work, no squeak-speak, only boom-bang later, he whispered. Whizclank, meanwhile, had initiated the creation of a phase-warp Jinx node, a parasitic relay designed to interface with Skritblam's remaining warp generators. Once activated, it would send false signals back to the Skaven Blight central relay system, showing Skritblam as having already fled the field, abandoning his post and declaring a coward's retreat, a death sentence, if believed. He stored the node within a hollowed-out skull, marked as Inspiration Totem, Do Not Touch, and left it on one of the rat paths Skritblam's tech runners frequently used. All it needed was to be brought inside his rival's control chamber, and both engineers waited, claws twitching, tails lashing, eyes gleaming with visions of the other's disgrace. Above all, they waited for the Council of 13's response. Neither knew that the squeak relays were malfunctioning worse than they feared. The Council's communications office had received both reports, interrupted by crackling static, screeching data, and a final corrupted fragment that simply read, "Boom, bad, much death, need more boom." The messages were passed around, mostly as a joke. "Clan Scryer's brightest," muttered one gray seer, rolling his eyes. Back on the battlefield, unaware that their desperate bids for vindication had become bureaucratic amusement, Skritblam and Whizclank prepared to launch their final proofs of blame. Victory no longer meant breaking the dwarf hold. Victory now meant the total annihilation of the other. And in true Skaven fashion, it would come not from strength or valor, but through sabotage, subterfuge, and mutually assured failure. Chapter 4: Tunnel of Terror. Beneath the blistered wasteland of the siege trench, a new plan was clawed into being under the shroud of night and desperation. The air was thick with soot and despair, every breath drawn through cracked masks and blistered lungs, but still the Skaven burrowed, always digging, always scuttling toward doom with the mad certainty of a race that had never known success without catastrophe. Warlock engineer Skritblam Sparkshock crouched in a crooked observation burrow, lined with flickering fungus globes and the skeletal remains of abandoned drill probes. His eyes glittered with feverish ambition, pupils contracted to pinpricks as he stared into a crude, static-ridden map etched across the dirt wall before him. The crude tunnel map was drawn in phosphorescent squiggle ink, an insane lattice of intersecting paths, pressure indicators, and skitter code. "Yes, genius, brilliance," he hissed, stabbing at the glowing lines with a sparking claw. Dig under, collapse foundation, boom topple, dwarf stone walls fall crack like old cheese. Around him, a swarm of rag-wrapped dig slaves toiled in silence, their spines bent and twitching from years of warp exposure. Some coughed green phlegm into rags. Others scratched at lesions pulsing with dark fluid. A few had already gone blind from the fumes, yet still they dug, clawed paws pulling away soil chunk by chunk, deeper into the cursed mountain. This was no ordinary tunnel. This was Planned Subterranean Victory Dig 17 Beta, personally overseen by Skritblam himself, after the disasters above ground had rendered traditional warfare, by Skaven standards, too orderly. He intended to tunnel directly beneath Karak-Vrath's eastmost tower, collapse the bedrock, and trigger a cascading avalanche of dwarf masonry and shame. It was a plan worthy of Scryer's greatest minds, or so he believed. Unbeknownst to Skritblam, in a repurposed scavenged dome half-submerged in rubble, Warlock engineer Whizclank Zapfang crouched behind a series of glowing scry orbs and distorted echo charts, his eyes locked on the same tunnel paths. A spy snare had picked up movement hours ago. A mole-cam, barely functional, grainy, and periodically bitten by something with too many teeth, had confirmed the impossible. Skritblam was digging a tunnel beneath the dwarf fortress. And more importantly, he hadn't shared the plan. Treason, sabotage, or worse, success without Whizclank. He could not allow that. With a shaking claw, Whizclank activated the dormant rows of VX-9 warp bombs, a volatile stash salvaged from a failed ambush on a Bretonnian caravan. The bombs were unstable. The charges had warped over time. The fuses were interpretive, perfect for sabotage. He called in two of his most deranged infiltrator sappers, Krizzle and Tok. Both were missing more fur than they had left. Their minds long since boiled into raw madness from close exposure to warp radiation. You place bombs, deep in dig path. Say you're helpers from engineering support squadron. Skritblam won't question. He never checks credentials, Whizclank chortled, spitting sparks from his voice box. Tok nodded so violently his eye popped out, dangling from a nerve string like a pendulum. He stuffed it back in with a giggle. Krizzle muttered something about cheese whispers and dragged a bomb across the floor with his teeth. Later that night, as the tunnel stretched ever further toward the heart of the dwarfen outpost, the booby-trapped gifts were delivered, sloppily hidden in the dirt, behind support struts, and beneath carts of mining tools. No one questioned the sudden appearance of extra help. No one noticed the bombs. The digging continued. And then came the breach. A soft crack, followed by a rush of cold air and the distant scent of something pungent and sour. The diggers froze. Skritblam's snout twitched as he sniffed the air. Stone, yeast, iron. No, something else. Old, fermented. He scratched his chin, eyes gleaming with savage curiosity. Dwarf vault. Secret storage. Must be. Forward, open now. The diggers broke through. A final strike with a clawed pickaxe crumbled the last wall of dirt, revealing a dark stone chamber beyond. A wave of cool, damp air poured in, thick with the unmistakable aroma of ancient dwarfen ale. The rats hissed in excitement and hunger, surging forward into the chamber. They had broken into an ale cellar. Barrels the size of siege towers loomed in the dark, stacked in solemn, rune-etched rows. Some had aged so long the wood had turned black, and the metal hoops shimmered faintly with residual runecraft. The floor was slick with spillage from generations of dwarf cask-draining rituals. Skritblam was already clawing at a barrel tap with a wrench, eyes wide and salivating. Spoils of war, loot, victory. Then a low click. One of Krizzle's warp bombs, jostled from its hiding spot by a drunken digrat dancing atop a half-smashed keg, armed itself with a shrill kee-ee-ee-eep that echoed through the tunnel like a cry of doom. The explosion was less a sound and more a sensation, pressure, heat, and blinding light erupting all at once. The bomb chain reacted with the others, and the resulting detonation didn't just collapse the tunnel, it obliterated it. Barrels shattered in a storm of splinters and sloshing fire. Ale vaporized into burning mist. The temperature shot upward in an instant, flash-searing fur and boiling eyes in sockets. The dirt roof of the tunnel was ripped away, sucked into a vacuum of explosive force that punched upward into the dwarf cellar like a cannon blast from below. Karakvrath shook, stone cracked, walls shuddered, and a tremor rolled through the fortress like the roar of an ancient beast. In the lower halls, dwarfs stumbled and fell, axes clattering to the floor. In the ale hall above the blast site, the clan elders were gathered, drinking, recounting grudges, and playing increasingly dangerous games involving sharpened beard rings. The floor erupted beneath them. A geyser of fire and shrieking rats burst through the stone like an unholy baptism, hurling casks and rubble through the air. The ceiling cracked, tables flipped, and in the chaos, one dwarf, drenched in a mix of ancient ale and warp blood, stood slowly, blinking through the smoke. He sniffed the air, heavily, twice, then roared. "They've broken the barley vaults." A howl went up from every dwarf in earshot, grief fury deep and booming. Ancient oaths were shouted, armor was fastened, hammers were lifted. Drunk beyond fear and now roused to a righteous wrath by the desecration of their sacred ale reserves, the dwarfs mounted a furious, impromptu counterattack. Down the stone stairs they came in a tide of steel and curses, many still wearing drinking hats or holding tankards in one hand and war axes in the other. Below, in the shattered tunnel remains, Skritblam crawled from a barrel fire, fur singed down to patches, face covered in soot and warped brew. One ear was gone. Both eyes bulged with disbelief. He heard the horns, the war chants, the approaching thunder of steel boots and bellies full of rage. "Retreat," he screeched. "Abort dig, surface, scatter flee." But the tunnel was collapsing. Behind him, diggers screamed as flaming barrels rolled across the shattered stone, crushing limbs and igniting fur. The explosion had opened a gaping wound between the mountain's underbelly and the fortress itself, and into it poured vengeful dwarfs thirsty for more than ale. The counterattack was underway, and in the distance, from a half-collapsed perch high on a burnt scaffold, Whizclank watched it unfold through a cracked spyglass. He saw the tunnel breach, the explosion, the dwarf surge. He grinned, metal teeth glinting in the firelight. Boom worked well, yes, then paused, squinted, because among the incoming dwarfs, bloodied, roaring, unstoppable, was a battering ram carved from a half-melted doomwheel axle. It bore his mark. His grin faded. Oh no. Chapter 5, Duel of Doompipes. The sun never truly rose over the Skaven siege camp. It merely leered behind a curtain of toxic haze, casting jaundiced shadows across the desolate wreckage of a once ambitious war effort. Smoke poured from twisted chimneys, and the constant screech of rusted gears filled the air like a swarm of iron flies. The earth itself trembled in intervals, burping up green fog and ash, remnants of the failed tunnel assault and the dwarfen countercharge that had nearly torn the warband in half. Despite the devastation, the Warlock engineers endured. They always endured. Warlock engineer Skritblam Sparkshock stood hunched atop a rusting signal tower, hunched like a carrion bird over a spread of blueprints charred around the edges. His claws twitched with manic excitement, eyes darting between schematics and the smoking horizon where Karak Vrath loomed. Around him, slave clanrats worked in silence, many bandaged, all terrified. The last failure had thinned their numbers, but Skritblam didn't care. The fewer rats around, the more glorious his personal victory. Yes, he hissed, jabbing at a particular spiral-shaped segment on his plan. Time now for genius moment. No more wheels, no more bombs, no more whiz-clank to steal glory, no. Today, Burrowbore 9000 will show-make who leads. The Burrowbore 9000 was less a drilling machine and more a subterranean nightmare given form, half magmatic tunneler, half warp-powered monstrosity. It resembled a gigantic mechanical serpent plated in soot-stained armor and mounted with rotating drill fangs the size of ogre limbs. The machine's core, a glass dome full of green-lit fluid and shivering rats wired into a control nexus, pulsed with unstable power. Skritblam grinned, his teeth blackened and crooked. This will bypass dwarf stone, crush walls from below, and rise burst like doomsnake from underfloor. Then I, Skritblam the ingenious, will stand atop rubble throne, yes. While Skritblam prepared to unleash his subterranean masterpiece. On the opposite end of the ruined siege camp, beneath a scorched tower, half built from broken scrap and melted pipes, Whizclank Zapfang unveiled his own declaration of supremacy. The Warpstorm Hailer, a towering three-spired structure of interwoven warp copper and obsidian amplifiers. It resembled an unholy mix between a cathedral organ, a signal tower, and a screaming mouth. Each spire housed a resonating warp chime, tuned to frequencies so unstable they could strip the skin from bone if activated in close quarters. Its intended function, to emit focused shockwaves of sonic energy, vibrations weaponized into aural obliteration. Whizclank adjusted the modulation dials, his clawed fingers trembling with anticipation. Sparks crackled across his body as he interfaced directly with the device, jacking a neural tether into his augmetic skull. His voice, tinny and hollow from overmodulation, echoed out. Prepare the storm, rats things. Witness glory pain of the warp storm hailer. It will scream the gates to ash, melt dwarf bones with sound murder. And no skrit-blam sabotage this time. He signaled the activation runes with both claws, the device beginning to hum with unnatural resonance. From each of the three spires, a chorus of low-frequency groans filled the air, like the earth itself mourning the war to come. Neither engineer knew the other was hours, minutes, from activating their ultimate invention. Neither cared. In their endless arms race of self-obsessed genius and mutual hatred, the only objective left was personal triumph. Glory, or at least the illusion of it, mattered more than strategy, more than victory, more than survival. The Burrow Boar 9000 was the first to move. Its segmented bulk groaned into life, churning beneath the earth like a mechanical worm. Warpstone-fueled drills spun into the soil, belching black steam as it tunneled toward Karak Vrath's central foundation. From above, only the bulging, steaming surface gave any sign of its movement, earth cracking like infected skin, emitting lightless tremors. Skrit-blam chattered gleefully, surrounded by twitching attendants feeding warp oil into auxiliary tanks. He leaned into a voice cone and screeched, "Maximum bore speed, submerge, serpentine glory, burst beneath the stone throne of Dwarfkin and consume destroy." Just as the machine dipped beneath the camp's lowest trench, Whizclank screamed his own activation command from across the camp. Now, hailfire, bring the voice of death." With a mechanical roar like the shattering of glass inside a collapsing cathedral, the Warpstorm Hailer discharged its first shockwave. The air bent. Reality shuddered. Sound ceased to be sound, and instead became pressure, heat, and violence. The resonance shot out in a focused beam, its target a segment of the dwarf walls, stone and rune-shielded. The sound wave hit, shattering a portion of the outer wall's decorative masonry and sending a dozen startled dwarf sentries ducking for cover. But then, things went wrong. Beneath the ground, the resonance struck an unanticipated echo chamber, one created by the freshly carved tunnel Skrit-blam's Burrow Boar 9000 had just drilled. The sound wave didn't stop. It followed the tunnel. It traveled down into the heart of the Burrow Boar. The machine, never designed to absorb high-frequency shock waves through its internal structure, seized violently. Warp fuel reservoirs ruptured. Screaming feedback surged through the pilot nexus, frying the minds of the connected rats. The dome cracked. Pipes burst. And the Burrow Boar exploded upward from the earth in a fountain of molten slag and pressurized warp oil, just as it reached the midpoint between both engineers' camps. It was apocalyptic. The explosion lit the night in green fire, blasting a crater the size of a warp furnace into the heart of the siege line. Dozens of Skaven, clanrats, engineers, tech slaves were vaporized instantly. Tents, machines, towers, ammo dumps, all obliterated in a chain reaction that traveled along the warp cabling used by both devices. The storm wave short-circuited everything it touched, causing electrical discharges to leap between warp fuel caches and barrels of chemically unstable compounds. The Warpstorm Hailer, its circuitry now flooded with backflow from the ruptured tunnel below, began to sing, a shrieking atonal wail that shattered skulls and turned blood to froth. The spires cracked under the pressure and fell inward, impaling dozens of Whizclank's followers. The central amplifier, overloaded with feedback, collapsed in a crescendo of squeals and lightning. Whizclank himself was flung across his workshop, smashing into a gear-covered wall with enough force to dent his chestplate and rupture one of his warp battery lungs. He slid to the floor twitching, static leaking from his augmetic eye like tears. On the other side, Skrit-blam was crawling from beneath a smoldering pile of debris. His fur burned away in patches, blood leaking from his ears, eyes wide and unseeing. He screamed, though he could no longer hear himself. Around them, Nothing remained but a yawning crater and drifting smoke. Where once the war camp had teemed with life and lunacy, now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the sizzling corpses of rats too slow to escape. A third of the army was gone, another third maimed beyond use, the rest scattered, terrified, feral. And atop Karak-Vrath's stone ramparts, the dwarfs watched the unfolding apocalypse with grim, amused disbelief. "Sounded like they were tuning bagpipes with a cannon," grunted a thunderer, reloading his rifle. "Looks like their leaders just flattened their own camp," another said. The Rune Lord narrowed his eyes, watching smoke drift from the ruins. Reinforcements may have heard that. Every dwarf holed in 100 leagues probably felt it in their beards. Should we counterattack? Wait, let's see what explodes next. Back below, amid the devastation, Skritblam and Whizclank lay broken, neither dead, neither victorious, both stripped of their war machines and dignity. And yet, even as the smoke curled above them, and the remains of their armies squealed in confused agony, both engineers reached out blindly, each scrabbling for something, anything to record a message. A report, a blame statement, because in Skavenblight, only the one who first tells the tale gets to be the genius, and the other, the scapegoat. Chapter 6. The Cheese Crisis. The Skaven siege camp, if it could still be called such, had become a hellish labyrinth of soot-smeared ruins and makeshift barricades, patrolled only by starving survivors and twitching, half-mad scavengers. Black smoke curled from smoldering husks of war machines. Ash settled thick on shattered helmets and broken bones, and the rank stench of burnt fur was soaked into every tattered flag and torn trenchcoat. Above it all, the shattered towers of Karak-Vrath watched with silent contempt, their battlements unmarred, their defenders well-fed and amused. In the heart of this charred wasteland, the tension among the remaining Skaven forces had reached a critical breaking point, not because of some renewed dwarfen counterattack, nor because of another failed war machine, but because of cheese. It began with a requisition order. Somewhere deep within the collapsing bureaucracy of the siege logistics web, among the warped punch runes and twitching scribes, a vital form, Form 982, a 4WPF warp fuel priority distribution, had been misfiled. Instead of allocating fresh warp fuel reserves to the shattered war machines and generator banks, the order redirected the entirety of the supply convoy to the frontline nutritional reserve. Unfortunately, that reserve had been reduced to a single leaking warehouse tent overseen by one-eyed clerk-rat Snizblot, who couldn't read and believed all shipments were meant for him personally. When the convoy arrived, carried by bloated pack rats dragging crates stamped "Toxic, handle only with prayers," Snizblot immediately assumed it was his long-overdue cheese shipment. He cracked open the first crate with a rusted claw and recoiled, not from poison gas, but from the overwhelmingly pungent aroma of perfectly aged, blue-veined warp cheese, Skavenblight Black Mold Deluxe. Highly addictive, highly unstable, highly sought after. Within an hour, word had spread. Cheese, not just food, cheese. The Skaven hierarchy, already fracturing from weeks of sabotage, explosions, and personal vendettas, collapsed under the sheer gravitational pull of cheese-driven madness. Clanrats descended upon the warehouse in frenzied waves, trampling scribes, tearing open crates with bare claws and gnashing teeth. The scent of fermented power triggered violent cravings in every half-starved rat within sniffing distance. Fights broke out. Claws slashed. Warp cheese was hoarded in trenches, traded for teeth, secrets, and the occasional live grenade. Some rats overdosed, bloating into gurgling, wheezing balloons before detonating in clouds of hallucinogenic spores. Within 3 hours, it was no longer a camp. It was a riot. Warlock engineer Skritblam Sparkshock, still limping from the burrow bore disaster, awoke to the sound of shrieking, chanting, and some kind of rhythmic slapping. He pushed aside the shredded curtain of his ruined command den and saw a mob of clanrats dragging a dead plague monk on a makeshift cheese altar, chanting, "Bless the mold mother, feed the hunger." No more orders, only cheese, One of them wore a melted doomwheel cog as a crown. Skritblam's blood froze. "Sabotage," he hissed, eyes narrowing. "This is no accident mistake. This is theft treason." His mind leapt immediately to Whizclank Zapfang, the burned husk, the saboteur, the plague upon progress. He summoned his surviving tech rats, only 4 answered, and one was missing his legs, and began composing a formal cheese accusation. The squeak recorder orb hovered before him as he spoke, spittle flying, gestures wild. "Council of 13, he'd hear this. This one, Skritblam Sparkshock, reports a supply breach, logistical perversion, and culinary betrayal. Sabotage most foul. Warp fuel diverted, cheese delivered. By whose claw? Whizclank, of course." He jabbed a claw at the orb as if expecting it to retaliate. Such coward plot. He knew my machines needed fuel. He wanted them starve-fail while he feasted. Sought to weaken me with cheese treason. No, I will not be undone by dairy. At the same time, in the shattered husk of a once grand storm coil bunker, Whizclank Zapfang was discovering that his command center had been stripped clean by cheese-maddened rats, who now believed his machine ruins were holy grounds of the Mold Mother's return. He stepped over what remained of a sermon-carved warp capacitor that now bore the slogan, "Eat or be eaten," in claw blood. Who dares turn my genius place into food temple?" he spat, his vocal processor crackling. "This is blasphemy. This is Skritblam's work, trick scheme to destabilize my command." He stumbled back to his vault, forced open the rusted data slab cabinet, and yanked out a fresh orb. "To the High Council," he shrieked. "This is Warlock Engineer Whizclank Zapfang betrayed again. Vital fuel supplies stolen by Skritblam Sparkshock, gluttonous swine rat. He hoards cheese like war trophies while my machines rot and my soldiers chew boot leather. He starves the siege. This is war crime, no less. Cheese treason of the highest order." He ended the recording by hurling the orb at the wall. It bounced, sparked, and replayed his scream in reverse. Meanwhile, across the camp, the riot had evolved. The cheese highs had become cheese withdrawals. The mold spores, released in mass from the chewed-open crates, were mutating the weakest. Patches of fur turned green-black. Eyes bulged and dripped. Teeth grew in places where teeth should not be. Small cults began carving rune slices of cheese into their foreheads and speaking only in bubbling nonsense, occasionally offering up warp fuel in exchange for more divine mold. A group of clanrats, calling themselves the Crumborn, stormed a nearby relay tower and declared it the new dairy hold. They launched cheese wheels like artillery at nearby Skaven factions. One made it over the trench wall and cracked a rat ogre's skull open. Another landed in the latrine pit and caused a chemical fire. The warband, what remained of it, was now split into factions. The cult of the Mold Mother, driven by cheese prophecy. The Crumborn, paramilitary zealots with cheese-based artillery. The Starvers, loyal only to food, who raided both sides. And the Engineer factions, still locked in eternal bureaucratic blame wars. Dwarfen scouts watching from Karakvreth's cliffs didn't even know what to make of it. One veteran, still sipping ale from a cracked tankard, shook his head. "They've turned on each other again. Over what? I think cheese." The scout frowned. Should we be concerned?" The Runelord watching from above simply stroked his beard and muttered, "No. Let them rot in their own madness. Seal the vaults tighter. They'll tear themselves apart." Back below, the final insult came when the central communications relay, used to send messages to the Council of 13, was overloaded. Not by sabotage or spell, but by a cheese-powered generator rigged by the Crumborn. They discovered that aged warp cheese emitted a faint charge when pressurized in old warp fuel drums. The signal system burst into flames, replaying the last dozen messages from both engineers in a corrupted, overlapping mess that screamed Skrit Clank, murder cheese, betrayal, melt, treason, treason, on loop until the tower finally exploded. Skritblam, curled in the ruins of his den, chewed on a dry ration strip and hissed, Soon, End will come. I still have a plan. Whizclank, covered in mold and hunched over a melted amplifier, whispered, "Final glory. No more cheese. Only war." But the war was already lost. To madness, to hunger, to cheese. Chapter 7. Clanrat Rebellion. There was a stillness in the camp. Not peace, never peace, but a tense, twitching quiet. The kind that slithered into trenches and settled under the bones of broken war machines. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the cheese riots. Warp fires guttered in the craters where war engines had once stood. The air reeked of mold, burnt metal, and exhaustion. Skritblam's Sparkshock limped through the shattered remains of what had once been his engineering yard, clutching a rust-stained volt wand and muttering to himself. His once pristine robes were little more than ash-caked rags. Every step left a sticky print of warp fluid leaking from a cracked power node bolted into his side. He stopped in front of a rusted cage podium, his pulpit for issuing orders, and activated the Vox cone. "Attention, listen, lowbloods. Dig pits must be cleared, new coil frames need building, and fuel drums replaced. Work now, or get flayed, flogged, flayed again. Your choice." Silence. No scurrying of clawed feet, no panicked responses. Nothing. He blinked, twitched. Did you hear not? Move? Still nothing. Only the wind whispering through broken pipes. Then, a sound like thunder. No, not thunder. Drums. Improvised drums. The rhythmic pounding of stolen tools on metal sheets, growing louder from the lower trench line. Then chanting. Not a war chant, not a holy screech to the horned rat. It was organized, repetitive, off-key. Pay in teeth, not in meat. No more bombs beneath our feet. The chant rose, echoing through the trenches with disturbing unity. From behind the shattered cover of a rusted doom wheel, a mass of clanrats emerged. More than Skritblam had seen in one place since before the cheese disaster. They marched in lockstep, bearing crude banners painted in blood and soot, emblazoned with broken gears and claws raised in defiance. At their head was Ricket Sharpfang, a grizzled, half-burnt veteran clanrat with a missing tail and an improvised pauldron fashioned from a melted ration tin. He held aloft a warped scroll, nailed to a spear. Skritblam squinted. What is this? Mutiny? Treachery? Ricket stepped forward and slammed the scroll into the mud. "Article of Demands," he growled. "From the newly formed Clanrat Union for safer war practices, reasonable explosions, and basic compensation." Union! The others chanted behind him, banging pipes together. Skritblam sputtered. "You can't unionize. Skaven don't unionize. We backstab, cheat, steal, undermine, never organize." But the chant continued. "Hazard pay or we won't stay. Fewer traps where we must lay." Across the camp, Whizclank Zapfang heard the noise through a scorched listening dish. His optics focused, his claws clutched a sparking control lever. Uprising, worker rebellion. Ha! Skritblam has lost control. Yes. He turned to his remaining tech thralls. "Prepare the counter-union appeasement protocol. Promise speaks safety, incentives, maybe cheese, what's left of it." With uncanny speed, a banner of his own was raised above his sector of the camp, painted with a hastily scrawled slogan. "Join Team Whizclank, fewer explosions than Skritblam marginally." That afternoon, both warlock engineers began the most bizarre campaign of their careers, not for conquest, not for sabotage, but for public favor among the clanrats. Skritblam, in a desperate bid to retain authority, scrambled together a morale restoration task force, composed of 2 half-dead scryer interns and a screeching plague rat he bribed with cheese rind. They marched to the Union camp with an official declaration nailed to a still-twitching tech rat. From Supreme Commander Skritblam Sparkshock, ingenious engineer of all that explodes. Clanrat duties reduced from 27 hours to 25 hours per workday. Explosive devices will now be clearly marked unless under covert conditions. Any clanrat surviving 3 missions will receive a loyalty tooth and 1 non-rotted boot. Daily cheese ration restored if supply lines stop exploding. He finished the address by activating a new prototype, the Friend Fuser 4000, designed to reward loyal clanrats with motivational electric jolts. It backfired immediately. The test subject's head exploded. The crowd screamed. The device hissed out a puff of cheese vapor and caught fire. Meanwhile, Whizclank deployed his own counteroffer. He constructed a crude stage, built from scrap barrels and old doom wheel rims, and addressed the clanrats directly, voice amplified through a half-working Vox mask. Listen, witness, loyal workers, Whizclank gives promise. New war machines with built-in escape pods, 50% fewer combustion failures. All volunteers rewarded with explosion insurance, guaranteed refund if you survive. He unveiled a new design, the Safe Scuttle Pod, a small metal box with one entrance and no ventilation. It promptly collapsed under its own weight, flattening the demonstration rat. Undeterred, Whizclank pulled a ragged banner into view. Also, new cheese shipment coming soon, probably, maybe, perhaps. The Union rats murmured. They were listening. Ricket Sharpfang, now flanked by makeshift bodyguards, stepped forward with his own demands. Fewer deaths, cleaner sleeping quarters, less screaming at dawn, and hazard pay, teeth or cheese, your choice. Also, no more using clanrats as test weights. Skritblam shrieked from across the trench line. This is extortion, bribery, manipulation. Whizclank responded via scream tube. This is negotiation, rat democracy. The negotiations devolved almost instantly. Skritblam fired a bolt of warp lightning across the field, missing Ricket but vaporizing a cheese shrine. The Union rats shrieked in horror. Whizclank retaliated by launching a sonic disruptor set to stun scream, which instead caused 4 nearby rats to bleed from the ears and collapse in seizure fits. The skirmish that followed wasn't a battle, it was a farce. Union clanrats stormed Skritblam's trench, only to be repelled by malfunctioning sentry drones that shot friend and foe alike. Whizclank attempted to airdrop incentive packages, boxes full of boot polish and squeak pills, but the parachutes ignited on entry and exploded in midair. By nightfall, the camp was a wreck again. Half the trenches were aflame. The other half had been turned into cheese cult ruins or makeshift bunkers for Union representatives demanding peace talks over charred rat flesh and spoiled milk. And somewhere, beneath a half-buried data terminal, a new scroll was being drawn up by the clanrats. It read, CLNRAT Union, Article 2, Leadership trials may be held if current commanders prove inadequate or fatal to our continued existence. It was signed in blood, cheese mold, and the shredded fur of 3 melted scribes. Skritblam collapsed onto a broken coil, twitching, eyes wide. Must win them back, must prove genius. Yes, one more plan. Whizclank coughed up a cloud of soot, his voice box rattling with sparks. Need bigger promise, something bold, something not explode, maybe? They didn't finish the thought, because the drums had started again. Union, we won't die. Unless we're paid, we won't comply. The siege had become a sideshow. The rebellion had become a movement. And the warlock engineers? They were just trying to keep up. Chapter 8, Dwarfen Counteroffensive. The sun never truly rose above Karak Vrath. It clawed weakly through the choking soot and warp fume haze, casting a bruised amber glow over the shattered battlefield. The air stank of melted ore, sour cheese rot, and the coppery stench of blood spilled days ago but never buried. Flies buzzed over piles of decaying corpses, Skaven and machine alike, while the low, warbling chants of the Union of Claw echoed through the half-collapsed trenches. The camp was fractured. Warp coils sparked erratically, trenches flooded with slush and leaking warp fuel. Clanrats refused orders, arguing over strike rights and hazard compensation. Cultists still praised mold gods in burned-out bunkers. The warlock engineers, once shrieking rivals vying for dominance, now sat huddled in the skeletal remains of what had once been the central command spire. Warlock engineer Skritblam Sparkshock clawed at the sides of his snout, twitching uncontrollably, eyes bloodshot and surrounded by weeks of soot-crusted fur. We are not failing, he insisted to the smoking remains of a data slate. We are regrouping, yes, a tactical recalibration. Beside him, slumped in a heap of exposed wires and melted armor plating, Warlock Engineer Whizclank Zapfang gave a wheezing snort of disbelief, his vocal box fizzing every other word. Recalibrate this, Sparkshock. We have no troops, no fuel, no morale, and now the Union wants us to issue break tokens and protective helmets. Their petty squabbling was interrupted by a distant sound. A horn, low, ancient, dwarfen. It echoed down the mountainside like a whisper from the deep, followed by a second, louder note, resonant and clear. Drums followed, the slow thunder of war-hardened discipline. Then came the clang of steel boots in rhythm, the synchronized pounding of shields. War horns flared again. The dwarfs were coming, and this time they weren't testing defenses or probing weak spots. This was a full-scale counteroffensive. From the smoke-choked slopes of Karak Vrath, they emerged. Armored phalanxes of hammerers, shielded ironbreakers, runes glowing cold blue in the murk. Thunderers with polished barrels, flame cannons pulled by armored goats. Rune lords chanted oaths older than cities, while a great anvil cart surged forward, pulled by groaning rune beasts. Their banners were streaked with black soot and old blood, their faces carved from stone. They marched not with haste, but with certainty, Skritblam screamed into the vox cone. Red alert, emergency, invasion, dwarfen storm coming, raise barricades, activate trench zappers, all pause report. Silence. The only response came from a nearby trench union delegate holding a sign that read, "We don't work under fire without fireproof cloaks." Whizclank kicked a burning rat carcass off the ledge and muttered, "We are doomed. Unless..." The two warlocks locked eyes. Something passed between them, hatred, yes, but also something deeper, necessity. Skritblam hissed, "Truce, temporary, no backstabbing, yet." Whizclank narrowed his eye. "For now, mutual survival pact, may explode after battle." They spat on their claws and shook, and with that, the most cursed collaboration in Skavenblight history was born. They worked like maniacs, barking, snarling, slapping parts together with the speed of desperate genius. Sparks flew as welding claws worked overtime. Schematics were drawn in blood and oil directly onto steel plating. Sobbing assistants were forced into jury-rigged cockpits, while volunteers were drugged and chained inside power conduits. The concept was simple. In execution, it was heresy. They called it the Doomwheel Doomrocket hybrid contraption. A weapon so unstable, so volatile, so Skaven that no sane race would ever dare build it. It had the core rotation engine of a doomwheel, great caged wheels spinning along gyroscopic rails, but welded to the back was a triple-stage rocket drive, originally designed for failed under-Empire lunar travel. The weapon bristled with arc cannons, warp lances, and one experimental doomscream audio cannon that had previously deafened a quarter of Clan Scryer's lab division. Fuel was whatever could burn. Power came from tortured rat batteries forcibly linked into a circuit loop. The pilot cabin was an old cheese crate with armor plating. It looked like a weapon designed by lunatics. It was a weapon designed by lunatics. The dwarfs were halfway down the ridge when it activated. "All units clear path," screeched Whizclank through the vox cone. "Or die in glory honor," added Skritblam with maniacal glee. The machine lurched forward with a metallic groan. The rocket boosters ignited with a flash that turned night into false dawn, and the entire machine screamed into motion, tearing across the battlefield. The ground split in its wake. Union clanrats, too slow to clear the way, were flung into the air. Their signs turned to shrapnel. The hybrid weapon barreled toward the dwarfen line, trailing smoke, fire, and desperate squeals from its crew. On the battlements, the dwarfs paused. A war priest lowered his hammer. "What in Grungni's beard is that?" The flame cannon operator blinked. I don't know. Fire, anyway." But it was too late. The Doomwheel Doomrocket smashed into their forward ranks, exploding not on impact, but after bouncing twice, pinballing through dwarf phalanxes like a flaming wrecking ball. The warp energy core detonated 5 seconds later, vaporizing the front line in a green-white flash. Rocks shattered. Armor melted. A rune priest was blown into the sky, still clutching his hammer. But that wasn't all. The blast collapsed the slope beneath the dwarfs, sending a full third of their assault force tumbling into the lower canyon, right into the spiked trench network below. Hundreds died. Dozens more were maimed. The organized sally turned into chaos. From his bunker, Skritblam stood upright, fur blown back, laughing hysterically. Whizclank joined him, sparks showering from his torn chestplate. "We did it, glorious doom." For a moment, just one, they stood united. Then they turned to each other, both thinking the same thing. If he takes credit, but the victory was short-lived. From the upper ridge, new horns blew, louder, harsher. A second dwarfen force emerged. Reinforcements, fresh and furious. Led by an iron-plated thane wielding a hammer the size of a warp furnace. "Prepare," Skritblam whispered. "Backstab later," Whizclank muttered. And they returned to their posts, screaming orders, bolting parts to rusted frames, while below them, Union rats drafted a new petition. Clause 12b. Any emergency superweapon deployment must include claimed safety measures and optional ejection seats. They added one final note in large clawed script, also, no more rocket wheels. But even as the ground quaked under the coming of dwarfen vengeance, Skritblam and Whizclank smiled. Because they'd tasted victory, just a sliver, and it was enough to keep the madness burning. Chapter 9. The Screaming Launch. The sky was a bruised, rotting purple, streaked with the toxic fumes of burning warp oil and the metallic tang of crushed ore. Smoke drifted in oily tendrils from the smoldering wreckage of a dozen failed inventions, and the earth trembled beneath clawed feet and dwarfen boots alike. The battlefield, once a functional siege camp, was now a diseased carcass of twisted metal, cratered trenches, and unburied dead. Even the wind seemed sick, carrying with it the last whimpers of dying clanrats and the distant roars of enraged dwarfs rallying for another push. Amid this ruin, in a clearing scraped clean by earlier explosions, stood the greatest abomination either warlock engineer had ever constructed. The Doomboom skitter wheel. If insanity had a physical form, if fever dreams, sabotage, and pure scryer arrogance were melted into one impossible shape, it would be this machine. Taller than a watchtower, wider than a dwarf hall, and held together by bolts that hissed with warp corrosion, the skitter wheel was a monstrous wheel of reinforced iron, warp brass, and crackling circuitry. Its exterior bristled with half-tested weapons, warp lightning emitters stitched onto spinning spokes, explosive pods strapped with prayer charms to delay detonation unsuccessfully, and serrated saw cogs that still had pieces of clanrat stuck in their teeth from the test run. At its heart, suspended in a cage of glowing green steel, pulsed the core, a warp furnace filled with tortured, half-alive rats wired together in a psychic circuit. Their screams were a constant, unending hum that vibrated the ground. Skritblam Sparkshock stood proudly before it, chest puffed out, tail flicking in triumph. His fur was burned away in patches, leaving raw skin that twitched with electrical scars. His voice crackled with manic certainty. "Behold, look, Whizclank, our greatest weapon, yes, yes, the Doomboom skitter wheel. With this, we crush-break dwarfs and prove who is genius, me." Whizclank Zapfang, barely standing after the last 24 hours of catastrophe, jabbed a sparking claw at him. No, my idea. My calculations made wheel go straight, not explode sideways. I designed steering." "You mean fail steering?" Skritblam snapped. "It turns not. That is problem." "Not my fault," Whizclank screeched. "You removed brakes to make room for rocket booster." Yes, for speed." "Idiot, imbecile. Speed without stopping is doomed fate." "Exactly, hence name Doomboom." Thus began another argument, one of many that had plagued the development of the skitter wheel. Their tempers were as frayed as the wires holding the machine together. They shoved, bit, slapped, and hurled insults, while unionized clanrats watched from a safe distance, taking notes for future hazard pay negotiations. But the engineer's petty feud was cut short by a sound that froze every rat spine on the field. A dwarfen horn, deep, resonant, furious. From the smoke-shrouded high ground the dwarfs advanced again, shield walls locked, runes burning cold blue. Their armor was dented, scorched, clawed, but their march never faltered. A full wedge of ironbreakers descended the slope with perfect unity, flame cannons rolling behind them, flanked by thunderers ready to fire. Skritblam and Whizclank exchanged a look, just long enough for mutual panic to replace mutual hatred. "Launch," Skritblam croaked. "Launch," Whizclank confirmed. They didn't hesitate. They didn't test. They didn't prepare. They simply pulled the rune lever, and the Doomboom skitter wheel awoke. Its core howled as the trapped warp rats screamed in a chorus that made the stones themselves vibrate. Sparks leapt from emitter to emitter, forming crackling webs of green light. The wheel began to rotate, slow at first, then faster, faster, faster still, faster than sanity allowed. The ground quaked, claws scraped. Union clanrats dove for cover as the monstrous wheel of doom began to screech. Scree! In a pitch so sharp several rats fainted instantly. "Release locks," Skritblam ordered. "No brakes, remember," Whizclank reminded, too late. The locks clattered open. The skitter wheel launched. Like a meteor, like a god-cursed comet of pure disastrous genius. It hurtled forward, shredding through its launch platform, flattening the last functional workshop and vaporizing several unfortunate clanrats who had been too slow or too curious to flee. Warp lightning arced wildly from its spokes, turning the surrounding air into a storm of green fire. It hit the first dwarfen line with a sound like mountains cracking. Ironbreakers scattered like kicked toys. Shields dented, bones shattered. The wheel plowed through them without slowing, without veering, without acknowledging the existence of physics. It flattened a flame cannon, scooping up the operator, who clung to the side screaming oaths as the machine dragged him in circles until he flew off like a discarded nail. The wheel continued, and continued, and continued. Skaven whooped, screamed, some cheered, others panicked, realizing it was accelerating out of control and curving, not toward the dwarf gate, but toward the trenches. Toward them. Skritblam froze. "Oh no, no, no," Whizclank squealed. "It has learned spite." The wheel sliced into the Skaven trenches like a circular guillotine, mowing down unionists, zealots, saboteurs, and anyone who had ever taken so much as a lunch break. Rats screamed in terror as they leaped over barricades or dove into mud tunnels. Explosives detonated in a chain reaction, mushroom clouds of warp gas rising in hideous green plumes. The skitter wheel, still gaining speed, smashed into the second dwarfen wave, those advancing from a hidden ridge in a flanking maneuver. They had no chance. The wheel rolled straight through their ranks, grinding armor into paste, sending bodies flying like broken puppets. Then it hit the mountain. The sound was indescribable. The wheel bit into the stone foundation of Karak-Vrath. The warp energy in its core surged. The mountain shuddered. A web of cracks raced across the cliffs. The dwarfs atop the battlements felt the tremor, stumbled, and stared in horror as the entire slope beneath them buckled. The cave-in began with a thunderous groan. First, a section of the cliff collapsed, swallowing the wheel as it still struggled to break free, its screams now muffled under tons of stone. Then the ground around the battlefield buckled, collapsing inward like a dying lung. Trenches caved, tunnels imploded, war machines sank. Screaming Skaven vanished beneath churning earth. The dwarf outpost itself shook violently as its lower foundations gave way. Stone halls cracked open, ale vaults burst, barracks folded like parchment. A final roar echoed across the valley as the entire battlefield was swallowed, a doom pit opening to consume both armies in one catastrophic, dust-choked implosion. When the rumbling ceased, only silence remained. The surface above was a jagged scar of collapsed rock and smoking rubble. The dwarfen outpost was buried deep beneath tons of debris. The Skaven camp, their trenches, their war machines, all crushed or swallowed whole. Dust clouds drifted like funeral veils. Nothing moved. For long moments, there was only stillness. Then, from beneath a slab of cracked stone, a single skeletal claw poked out, followed by another. Two battered, soot-stained warlock engineers dragged themselves free of the rubble. Skritblam's remaining ear twitched. Whizclank's augmetic eye flickered weakly. They looked around at the oblivion they had wrought. No dwarfs in sight. No clanrats. No camp. Nothing but annihilation. Skritblam coughed. "We won?" Whizclank wheezed. Yes, I think so." They collapsed onto the rubble. For one quiet heartbeat, there was peace. Then Skritblam nudged Whizclank. "Your fault." No, your fault." And the feud began anew, echoing through the lifeless, dust-choked wasteland where two armies had vanished under the weight of their madness. Chapter 10. Back to the Under Empire. The journey back to the Under Empire began not with triumph nor with shame, but with the slow, miserable clawing of two half-dead, half-mad engineers out of a mountain-sized grave. Skritblam Sparkshock and Whizclank Zapfang crawled through a choking fog of dust and pulverized stone, coughing up flecks of blood and warp-tainted debris. Their robes were tatters. Their fur, what remained of it, was matted with ash, dried ichor, and the stench of dead things. Their tails dragged limply behind them, leaving shallow depressions in the brittle terrain. Behind them lay the ruined battlefield, once a sprawling siege camp, now an obliterated wound in the mountainside. Karak itself had disappeared beneath a vast sinkhole, entombed in its own foundations. No dwarfs remained to curse them, no clanrats to obey or rebel, no machines left to explode or ignite, just silence, deep, endless, mocking. Skritblam limped ahead, dragging a fractured data slate behind him like a precious relic. "We survive live," he wheezed. "Proof of greatness. Yes. Council will reward us." Whizclank snorted, sparks flicking from his damaged augmetic eye. "Reward? They will praise me. Skritblam ruined all thing, exploded every machine I built. You sabotaged my designs. No, you removed brakes. Because you installed unstable warp batteries. Their arguing devolved into weary hissing as both collapsed on a slab of cracked stone, gasping like dying vermin. It took them 4 attempts to stand again. The path back to the Under Empire was long and treacherous. Collapsed tunnels forced them to squeeze through narrow crevices reeking of decay. They crossed abandoned Skaven burrow cities whose inhabitants had long since fled, leaving behind rusted traps that snapped at their ankles like starving mouths. They navigated fungus-choked caverns where luminescent spores drifted like ghost lights, clinging to their skin and whispering in soundless voices. At one point, a pack of blind crypt things, rats warped into pale, twisted horrors, surged from the dark. Skritblam drove them back with a malfunctioning volt wand that fired at random angles, shocking Whizclank twice and temporarily stunning himself. When the pair finally reached the outskirts of Skavenblight, the city of madness and machinery stretched before them like a vast, toxic wound. Towers of warpstone and rusted iron pierced the sky, emitting plumes of green smoke that made the air shimmer with fumes. Burrowing tramcars screeched through underground tracks. Fungal farms pulsed with diseased light. The constant clatter of gears, screams, explosions, and sermons to the horned rat filled every moment. Home. Filthy, lethal, welcoming home. They staggered through the gates. No guards bothered to question their origins. Into the sprawling labyrinth of Clan Scryer's industrial district. Warlocks in soot-stained robes marched past them, dragging slave rats toward a testing arena where a new doom cannon prototype boomed loud enough to shake rotting teeth loose. Sparks rained from the sky like sickly fireflies. Skritblam clutched his cracked data slate. "We must report. Tell of victory, failure, success. Tell of doom, dwarfs crushed, yes. Whizclank puffed out his chest. And tell how I saved all, destroyed none, engineered everything. Skitterwheel, my masterpiece. Lies, but neither had time to bicker further, because the Council of 13 was waiting, dragged into the heart of Scryer headquarters by a swarm of snarling storm vermin. Both engineers were marched through corridors lined with malfunctioning Tesla coils, bubbling warp vats, and execution pits filled with twitching remains of those who displeased the clan. At last they were thrown into the great chamber, An arena of smoke, flickering green flames, and massive bronze sigils shaped like jagged skulls. 12 robed figures sat atop rusted thrones, representatives of the council, their identities masked by runed helms and cowl shadows. The 13th seat sat empty, reserved for the mythical leader who never appeared, never spoke, yet whose presence loomed as an echo in every breath. The air hummed with tension. A voice, distorted through vox scramblers, boomed from the shadows. Sparkshock, Zapfang, step forward. They did, trembling, leaning on each other from necessity rather than trust. Another voice followed, older, harsher. Reports received. Squeak messages corrupted. Many explosions, much death. Siege of Karak ended in collapse? Whizclank immediately thrust a claw to his chest. Yes, because Sparkshock sabotaged. He made cheese disaster. Skritblam pushed him aside. Lies. Whizclank destroyed coils, blew doomwheel, caused sinkhole. I survived victoriously. The two fell into a frenzy of accusation, gesturing wildly, exaggerating, contradicting each other in frantic squeals. They described dwarfs 10 times taller than reality, claimed to have held off entire legions single-handedly, insisted their inventions were flawless until sabotaged by the other. They blamed union uprisings, cheese cult rebellions, tunnel collapses, unintended cave-ins, and weather interference, despite being underground. When they finished, panting, the chamber fell silent. Then the council laughed. A horrible, screeching, echoing sound, like metal scraping bone, like rats dying in slow agony. One counselor slammed his staff into the floor, silencing the chamber in an instant. Failure success, he declared. Both engineers blinked. Whizclank whispered, failure success is good? No, Skritblam hissed. Failure success is worst. The counselor elaborated. You destroyed entire war camp, buried dwarf outpost, eliminated clans, machines, and resources, but also killed many enemy things, caused great chaos. Much distraction, impressive failure, productive disaster. Another voice chimed in. Council demands punishment reward. Stormvermin stepped forward. Skritblam screamed. Whizclank wailed. They were beaten, shocked, dunked in warp fluid, forced to sign conflicting blame reports, and finally hurled into a pit full of malfunctioning servoskulls that nipped and gnawed at them until they crawled free, missing chunks of fur and dignity. But they lived, barely, and as they limped out of the chamber, coughing up warp smoke and pride, a hooded council clerk intercepted them with a scroll. For Sparkshock and Zapfang, he hissed. New assignment. Twidgy. Both froze. A joint assignment, the clerk added. Their tails curled in horror. No, Skritblam whispered. Anywhere but together. Anywhere but here, Whizclank groaned. The clerk unrolled the scroll, revealing maps stained with blood and exotic spores. Strange reptiles and towering trees were sketched crudely in the margins. The symbol of Clan Pestilence was scribbled beside the coordinates. Deployment to Lustria, the clerk announced. Both warlocks paled. Lustria, jungle of death, home to monsters far worse than dwarfs, a land of humidity, disease, ancient magics, and cold-blooded nightmares, a place where even Skaven tread cautiously. Skritblam squeaked. But we barely survived mountain, Whizclank sputtered. Together, again, impossible. The clerk shrugged coldly. Council says you're best-worst pair for mission. Perfect for dangerous feudal operations. And with that, the scroll was thrust into their claws. They stared at it, then at each other. Hatred flared. Fear followed. Then resignation. Because no one refused the council. Not twice. As they limped out of the chamber and toward the tram line that would take them to the Under-Empire's southern tunnels, Skritblam muttered, We will die there. Whizclank nodded grimly. Yes, but I promise you first. Skritblam hissed. Try it, I dare. They bickered the entire way to the transport. And in the shadows above, unseen, the Council of 13 whispered among themselves. Send them to Lustria, rasped one. And pray they never return, answered another. Or do return, a third mused, with more chaos for us to exploit. Their laughter followed the engineers like a curse. Skritblam and Whizclank boarded the transport. The doors slammed shut, and the Under-Empire swallowed them once more. Two rats bound for the most lethal jungle in the world, carrying with them an unkillable feud destined to birth even worse disasters than the siege of Karak Vrath.